Okay, it's a couple minutes past 7, so I think it'll be good for us to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to what is unbelievably our first AIA CASA archaeology talk of the academic year. For obvious reasons with the pandemic, we've been sort of thrown into sorts with our organization and our planning for our lecture series this year. And we had a couple talks lined up, obviously, for the fall term, and with travel restrictions and whatnot, those have all been, I don't want to say canceled, but I want to say postponed. And we hope to get people back to us. I believe I know almost everyone online, but just in case you don't know who I am, my name's Scott Pike. I am a faculty member at Willamette, and I'm the president of the Salem Society of the Archaeological Institute of America, who is one of the sponsors of tonight's lecture. So is the Center for Ancient Studies and Archaeology, which also supports the archaeology and work and ancient studies work that we do at Willamette. So I want to welcome everyone tonight. This is our first and sadly only talk of the fall semester, but we are very, very glad that we can have it and present it for you. And I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment. I do want to mention that we are planning 2 remote talks in the spring, and you will receive announcements for those when the final details are cleared up and settled. But do know that we are planning to have some springtime activities and presentations for the community. And I also will be remiss if I don't make a small plug for the AIA. This is a membership-driven organization that in normal years, we would have maybe 9 to 10 in-person presentations every year to present to the Salem community on archaeology, both in Europe and Asian subjects, as well as American subjects, North and South. So I want to encourage you to join if you haven't already. And during the presentation tonight, I will put the address for the membership webpage in the chat feature on Zoom. Before we get started, also just a couple rules, or not rules, but requests for you as you listen to the talk. We have it set that when you logged in, your microphone should be on mute. So I'm going to ask that you please keep your microphone on mute unless you're Kimberly or Kirsten. That would be a bad idea. So please keep it on mute just so we don't hear the sounds of your house in the background. And then at the end of tonight's presentation, we will have a question and answer session. But just to keep the control of the chat room, what we're asking is that you please type in your questions in the chat feature, and then I will ask Kimberly those questions at the end. Okay, so without much further ado, let me introduce tonight's speakers. So tonight we have Kimberly Fitzgerald and Kirsten Strauss. They are both archaeologists and historic preservation officers in the city of Salem. We've had I've gotten to know them over the past few years and been very excited and very thankful for the projects that we've been able to do together at the JasonLee house site, which we'll hear about tonight, but also some other ones. So this is a special privilege for me to invite them to speak to us today. Just to say a little bit about Kimberly, she's the real deal. She was recently awarded this year a Community Engagement Award from the Society of Historic Archaeology for her work and coordination of bringing the community together for the Chinese shrine excavation that happened at Pioneer Cemetery just a couple of years ago. And also the work that she has done, and Kirsten has supported as well, has received various awards from the Historic Preservation, from the Salem Historic Landmark Commission, as well as from the City of Salem's mayor and the City of Salem's council. So the work is being recognized, and I think she strives to bring in the community to archaeology, and I think that should be awarded and recognized. So I just want to say that before we get started. So, so I will yield the microphone to Kimberly and Kirsten. You can see their titles on the screen. And thank you again for being here.
Well, gosh, thanks. Thanks so much, Scott. And I do also want to acknowledge and how much we appreciate the partnership for the last 4 years with
Yeah,
Willamette University. And we couldn't have done those projects without your help. So in fact, you and Ross on this particular project are going to have your photo taken with the mayor next week. So.
yes, I know.
It's not just us that do the work. So thank you very much. So thanks for having us. And we're very excited to share with you the specifics of this project. But before I jump in, anyone who knows me knows that I love process. And I want to give you kind of an orientation about our program within the city of Salem. And a little bit of background on how we've grown our archaeological program over the last 3 or 4 years. So the city of Salem became a certified local government in 1986. This program is actually through the National Park Service and is administered through the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, which happens to have its offices here in Salem. And we've been able to take advantage of the CLG grant program over the years and have received funding for many different projects. Last year, we received funding to update our historic preservation plan, which is a component of our comprehensive plan. Why that matters is it has a specific goal to protect archaeological resources. And this is important not only to help us apply for grants, but it also allows the Landmarks Commission to include archaeological projects in their work plan, which they adopt every year. And this year, the JasonLee site, the JasonLee project was identified as a priority in that work plan. So Salem used to be a central gathering place for tribes in the region. It's a great place to live. It's always been a great place to live. We've identified over 250 known archaeological resources in Salem, and those are protected by state and federal law. And one of the things that we've been working on over the last few years is to establish local protections. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute. But in order to make that local protection work, we have developed a map. And this map identifies not just where all of Salem's resources are, but also identifies where there's a high probability of encountering resources during construction, so a high probability zone. So this map was just finalized this year. We built it with the cooperation of the State Historic Preservation Office and the tribes that are interested in what happens in Salem. And I'll show you a little picture of it here in a minute, but it's being utilized to assist us in implementing our code and determining whether projects need additional review. And this map is known as our Cultural Resource Protection Zone map. So we've also been working hard on educational programming over the last few years, in particular to build an understanding about those archaeological resources that we have in Salem that we do know about. You can see a poster here from a few years ago that was from our pop-up exhibit for the artifacts that were recovered from the police facility. So that's actually a picture of culturally modified glass that we found on the site. And as I mentioned before, this was we've had many years of collaboration and cooperation with Willamette, and also several university students have been interns here at the city. We have an archaeological lab, and last year several students did their final theses and research projects using some of our collections and sites. And so one student did their final thesis on a collection from the police facility, and we had several do their final theses on a site and the collections from a site downtown at 440 State. So that was pretty cool. We also worked hard to, there's something strange on this, establish partnerships with the different tribes who have an interest in our community. A memorandum of understanding was signed this year with the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and this is where we committed to work together on the identification and protection of our archaeological resources. And we're looking to sign another MOU later this month with the Siletz, and hopefully we'll do the same with Warm Springs. So great, now the next slide. So there are many laws that protect archaeological sites and objects in the United States, beginning with the Antiquities Act of 1906, and then additional protections added in the 1960s. You can see some of those laws there on the screen. NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 is a really significant law. And then in Oregon in particular, we have a lot of state statutes that protect pre-contact Native American sites, but also historic archaeological resources. And a key thing to keep in mind, especially because I will be mentioning it later, is that here in Oregon, state law requires that an archaeological permit be obtained prior to any ground disturbing activity on an archaeological site. And in order to apply for that permit, you need to know a significant amount about the history and its significance. So for protection locally, we wanted to establish local protection in addition to that federal and state protection for archaeological resources, but also process-wise incorporate it into our design review and our building permit processes, especially for those permits like grading permits or building permits that authorize ground disturbing activity, because in my experience, that's really where the rubber hits the road. If you're not aware of where the resources are and whether they're significant, and you don't have that plugged into your permitting system, you don't really have a good way of protecting those resources. So with the historic preservation plan and the MOU as a good foundation, we worked with our Landmarks Commission and our council and of course our city attorneys to establish local criteria and processes for the review of projects that are within that zone that I talked about earlier. So you can see kind of a screen capture of the map. It's available on our website now. If you want to, you can go type in an address and see if it's in that cultural resource protection zone or not. And as I mentioned earlier, this map was developed in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office and those tribes that are interested in what happens here. And it encompasses not just our known sites, but also our high probability areas. And so as part of that, what routinely happens when we have a pre-application conference for a new development, or there's a land use application or a building permit that comes through what's called our roundtable, we look it up on this map. And if it is within this zone, then it triggers my looking at it and reaching out to the property owner or developer. In addition to that, for the major projects, we have regular archaeological roundtable meetings where we discuss those projects. So here's a beautiful flow chart that demonstrates what happens. So if you've identified that your project needs clearance, typically those types of projects, they're not for all of them. So we don't have this process in place for private property where there's a development that's privately funded. Right now, it's just on public properties or private projects with public funding. And it's required before the issuance of any building or grading permits that authorize that ground disturbing activity that's happening within that zone I had talked about before. So part of that clearance includes an assessment of the site's significance, as well as the impact of the development on any potential resources that are there. So now I'm sure you're relieved. We can jump into how this worked on the JasonLee site. So in November 2019, the proposal for this new mixed-use building was approved at Salem's Planning Commission. And because this project is located within our cultural resource protection zone, and because they're receiving public money, this proposed new development triggered that review I was talking about earlier. It requires that clearance review before any ground disturbing activity can be authorized. So to kind of orient you, if you don't know where it is already, this is located at 990 Broadway Street, Northeast. And this next picture shows you the site doesn't look that interesting. It's just a parking lot with a vacant, undeveloped grassy area. And why is it important? Well, now I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten, and she's going to tell you about the significance of the site and why JasonLee matters to Salem.
Kirsten, you're on mute, so just.
There we go. Sorry, the menu wasn't popping up and then I was changing slides instead of doing what I thought I was doing. Okay, so thank you for having us. I just wanted to mention that I am a former Willamette student, also a former intern of this program. So it's pretty exciting to be coming back in this capacity. So I really appreciate you having me and thank you so much. What I would like to talk to you guys about today is how this JasonLee site fits into the wider context of Oregon history and westward expansion in America. JasonLee is a pretty important figure in Oregon history. This is a couple of statues of him. One of them is in the Oregon State Capitol grounds, and the other is at the the U.S. Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. Oregon has two people in the Washington, D.C. Statuary Hall. It's JasonLee and John McLaughlin. So that gives you kind of an idea of sort of the resonance that JasonLee has within the traditional narrative of Oregon history and sort of how important he is to that narrative. The reason that he's really important in Oregon history is that he's largely credited with bringing Oregon under American control rather than British control. He's superintendent of the Willamette Mission, which sort of eventually, in like a weird way, becomes Willamette University. He also chaired the first provisional government meeting, and he also helped build Salem's first stick frame structure, which is the house that we'll be talking about, and which is still standing at the Willamette Heritage Center. But before we kind of dive into JasonLee, I want to talk about this area's earliest residents. So this is the traditional homeland of the Santiam Kalapuya. I think the Kalapuya are a pretty interesting tribe because they're made up of a lot of different bands that had separate or distinct languages and distinct cultural practices. And so you see this map right here shows you sort of the layout of some of these Kalapuya bands. Salem is sort of a meeting area. Kim mentioned earlier that the word Chamickety kind of translates roughly to meeting place or gathering area, and that's because Salem is sort of at the nexus of several different tribal territories. So that's one of the cool things about Salem. You can actually kind of hear that Chamickety is anglicized to Chemeketa, so you can kind of hear that's the indigenous word for this area. And I've also included sort of the indigenous word for the Willamette, which you can kind of hear eventually turns into Willamette, but it was Wallamoo or Wallamay is the indigenous word for the river. So when we start to talk about the Oregon country, I think it's important to get some of the timeline details down. And first, you've kind of got some Euro-American explorers who come to the area in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. These are not the first examples, they're just some more famous examples like Lewis and Clark and Astor's expedition in 1811. And prior to 1818, there had been many countries who had an interest in the Oregon country, including Russia and a lot of other places. But by the time it gets to around 1818, it's only the United States and Britain that have any sort of vested interest in the Oregon country, which is sort of generally defined as this area of Canada all the way down to the bottom of Oregon. So that is in 1818, they agree to joint occupation, which essentially means that they just agree not to fight over it, at least not for now. So that's kind of a funny agreement, I think. But one of the results of this agreement is that the Hudson's Bay Company establishes a fort in Fort Vancouver in 1824. John McLaughlin is the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, and it becomes a really strong nexus of trade for the area. And that's really the trade trading furs, which is really a very large export for the Hudson's Bay Company. They make a lot of money off of it. You can see this is John McLaughlin's statue in the Oregon State Capitol grounds. It's a little more dramatic than JasonLee's. I think it's kind of funny. And then this is sort of the famous picture of McLaughlin. And you can see this is a portrait from the state capitol of McLaughlin greeting some of the folks who get off of, I believe, the Lausanne in the early Oregon history. So it's kind of a few examples of McLaughlin there. So these trade networks were really well established, and they were quite complicated. There are trade routes in between indigenous groups. There's trade routes between trappers in the area, many of whom are indigenous. The Santiam Kalapuyan specifically traded a lot of camas and wapato, which was a pretty cool like dried cake that they made that could last the whole winter. So it was a very valuable trade resource. Trappers are also coming from all over the world. You have trappers from the Pacific Islands, you have trappers from French Canada, you have trappers who are coming from all over, which ultimately leads to a pretty devastating outbreak of disease in the area. There's one historian, Robert Boyd, who estimates that specifically the Upper Kalapuyan declined nearly 88% from 1805 to 1841, which is a pretty tragic statistic, I think. But what I think is important about that statistic in terms of JasonLee is that he's arriving right at the end of that sort of population decline for indigenous people in the area. And what that means for him and his missionaries is that they arrive to a Willamette Valley that is a lot different than what they're expecting. They are expecting a lot of people. They're expecting it to be pretty easy to missionize and spread Christianity. But what they find is that there's not that these well-established networks that have been there for many, many decades are sort of breaking down, and something new is arising out of that. So the first Willamette Mission was about 10 miles north of Salem, located at what is now the Willamette Mission State Park. You can see this is a sketch of it, and this is sort of an old, they made like a ghost structure of the building, so you can see where it was actually on site if you go visit the Mission State Park. It was about 10 miles north of Salem, but they decided pretty early on that it wasn't a very good location. It was really prone to flooding. There's a lot of mosquitoes. There's some kind of like funny letters about people complaining about mosquitoes. So it's like kind of a funny thing to read when you look back. And so you can see that's about 10 miles away from Salem. We have like kind of a simplified version that we do for little kids of this presentation. And I always ask them how they think that JasonLee and the folks got down to Salem. And they always say like horses or walking, but they actually took a canoe. So that's kind of one fun little fact. So they arrive in what is now Salem in 1840. They decide to move in 1840. They start building in 1840, and they've officially moved all of their work here in 1841. And it's founded by an existing Kalapuya village. That's one of the reasons that they chose this area, is because they had pretty good access to that existing village that was here. They built this house, which is the house. That's the house that we're talking about, and the house that was excavated just this year. And they also built a wood mill. And I don't think we actually know exactly where that wood mill was. We know that it was in the vicinity along the creek there, but we don't know exactly where it was built, which I think is kind of, maybe that's our next project. This is a map of Salem from 1852. It's a GLO map, which is what the government used to track donation land claims. And I think that this map is really interesting to show sort of the different setups that the missionaries had created in Salem when they were here. You'll see that this top square right here says J.B. McLean. He's the person who bought the JasonLee Mission House after the missionaries had used it. Right down here is the Methodist Institute, or the Indian Manual Labor School, which is eventually sold to the Oregon Institute, which eventually becomes Willamette University. So that's kind of the tie between the mission and the university. And then right over here is the JasonLee Cemetery. So this is on D Street now, and it's like right by the Oregon State the Oregon State Hospital. So that gives you a little contextual understanding of how far away all of these different things are. And that is actually one of the reasons that Salem became an interesting place for newly arriving Euro-American settlers to come to, is because there was already a lot of infrastructure set up here, and it was already pretty well established by the time large numbers of people were starting to arrive. So it's not all great for the missionaries. There's actually a lot of critiques of the Willamette Mission, and I think this is kind of one of the really interesting parts that you get about JasonLee, is that he is this really big figure in Oregon history, but he he died kind of in disgrace. He was fired. People in the mission were complaining about his work. And so I think this sort of transition from this sort of opportunistic colonizer that he gets portrayed as into this sort of like hero of Oregon colonization is one of the interesting parts about Jason Lee's story. Some examples of that, if you've got members of the mission party who are writing to the mission board on the East Coast that Lee's not managing it well, that he's got a lot of kind of weird personal stuff that he doesn't know how to deal with well. The board's really unhappy that he never sends in any reports, which is kind of funny. I feel like that's such a modern like problem. He's like, will you please send us this report? And he just never sends the reports. But there's also this sort of general demoralization by the missionary work, because there's a lot of the students who are going to the Indian Manual Labor School are dying, and it really affects their ability to do missionary work, because nobody wants to take their kids there because they keep dying, which is very understandable. And they also are really unsuccessful at converting really anyone. So there's a lot of really legitimate critiques of Lee and his mission work. One of the most significant critiques is that he and his missionaries have turned away from the mission work to land speculation. And this is a quote from Lieutenant Wilkes, who visited the area in 1841. You can see here that, he was really disappointed in what he found. All of the missionary members had made selections of land in 1,000 acres each, in prospect that the whole country would follow under American dominion. So I think some of these critiques are pretty legitimate, that they had focused away from doing missionary work towards this pretty lucrative idea that America might take control of the Oregon country. Sorry, my old cat is yelling. I don't know if you can hear him. Okay, so Lee and Oregon history. So because of all of these critiques, the Methodist Mission Board on the East Coast decided to dissolve the mission in 1844. So they send Reverend George Gary to the West to dissolve the mission and sell off all of the pieces. Lee actually kind of catches wind of this, and he sails to the East Coast to defend himself to the board. And the board kind of believes him. They're like, okay, but it's too late to recall Gary. So Gary does go ahead and dissolve the mission. But they do compensate Jason Lee with the title of superintendent to the Willamette Institute, or the Oregon Institute. So he is sort of one of the first people who is advocating for this school that was sort of geared towards the children of settlers who were starting to arrive in more and more numbers every year. But unfortunately, before he makes it back to help the Oregon Institute get started, he dies in his hometown of Stanseed, Canada in 1845 after essentially being fired. So I think it's pretty fascinating that he kind of like dies in obscurity. And there's also a lot of slightly later histories of Jason Lee that are also very critical of him. One pretty significant example of that is the Oregon volume of Bancroft's works, which is a very famous sort of collection of history about the United States. One interesting thing about the Oregon volume is it was written by a woman, Frances Fuller Victor, which they were able to kind of discover much later. So I think that's a pretty fascinating fact. And the way that Victor characterizes Lee, she characterizes the efforts of the missionaries as a curse and a burst peat bog sowing its black mud over the land. And then she goes on to describe the feeling of the other missionaries when Lee is getting off of the boat with his new wife just after his old wife died in childbirth. It says, and now the revulsion of feeling was so great that the supremacy of Jason Lee in their hearts was thenceforth the thing of the past. So even in later histories, he's really not taken very seriously, or is taken as an important part of early Oregon history. But that changes starting in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There's a lot of books written about the mission and about Oregon during this time period. It was a pretty good way to make money, frankly, because a lot of people were really interested in what was happening in Oregon. And I have one title for you. This is one of my favorite titles that I found while I was doing this research. This is by Reverend Atwood, and it's published in 1907. The Conquerors, Historical Sketches of the American Settlement of the Oregon Country, embracing facts in the life and work of Reverend Jason Lee, the pioneer and founder of the American Institution on the western coast of North America. So you can see there's a lot of like really grandiose language that goes into these sort of like rewrites of his history, kind of trying to like reclaim I mean, I don't know, I don't think reclaim is the right word because there's a lot of connotations to that word that I don't think apply here, but they sort of like reclaim this fallen man to be the sort of hero of colonization. And you see that a lot in these books. One of the most, I suppose, the sort of point, the like where this comes to a head is in the reburial of Jason Lee in Salem in 1906. So nearly 60 years after he died, people organized to get his remains reinterred in Salem since he died in Canada. So it was a pretty big, organization that they had to do, and the celebratory party that they had. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it was a very big deal. There were quite a few people there. There's a lot of really important figures in the community who are giving eulogies in his honor. And I want to give one quote from one of the eulogies, and I want you to think about this quote in comparison to that quote from Francis Fuller Victor. The work that Lee did to colonize the country with American citizens under the trying difficulties of the situation proved of incalculable value. Jason Lee was a remarkable man of great determination and wonderful foresight, but like others of the great benefactors of his race, he was not understood in his time. Through ignorance of the situation, his church dismissed him from the control of his affairs here most unjustly and cruelly. His vindication has come. So that's a eulogy given at the reinterment ceremony by Honorary J.C. Moreland in 1906. So you can see that sort of all traces of this critical eye to Jason Lee have really disappeared by the time you get to the early 1900s. And there's another historian who kind of talks about this as a general theme. I would encourage you to check out the work of historian Peter Bogue. He has a really interesting article in the OHQ about how this is sort of a trend across all of these sort of early colonized areas, that by the time this first generation of pioneers is dying, that there's a lot of anxiety about commemorating their work and sort of passing off the onus of colonization onto this earlier generation. And a lot of that happens through these ceremonies and these memorials to the first generation. I just want to point out this little picture. This is a picture from the 1940 centennial in Oregon, and this is a couple of local folks playing Jason Lee and his first wife, Anna Maria Pittman Lee, in a play about their lives. So just thought that was kind of a funny little thing to toss in there as an example of how that continues even through the modern day. I mean, I guess that's not modern, but it does continue through the modern day. So I want to take just a second to zoom out a little bit and talk about what is happening contextually in Oregon during this time period for Jason Lee. So in 1846, the United States and Britain formally agree to the 49th parallel as the division between their two lands, and that makes Oregon Territory official. It's officially part of the United States, though it is not a state yet, not until 1859. The Donation Land Claim Act passes in 1850, and that's really headed by Samuel Thurston, who was a local guy who went to Congress to really push this act through Congress. There's a similar, this is sort of a side note, but there's a similar reinterment ceremony for Thurston in Salem as well, because he dies on his way back, sort of like in the middle of nowhere, and they organize a big ceremony to reinter him here in Salem as well. So kind of just an interesting parallel there, I think. But one of the sort of troubling things, that's not quite the right word, but one of the hard things about this Donation Land Claim Act is that the United States government really ratified this act before they had ratified any treaties with indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest and at least in the Willamette Valley. And what that means is that the United States government is really giving away land that they haven't officially purchased or anything like that. So it's really kind of one of those really stark and frustrating injustices that you find when you study the history of early Oregon colonization. I think another really stark injustice is the non-ratification of treaties that happens in 1851. And this is an example of the Santiam Kalapuya tribe specifically, but this happened to a lot of different tribal leaders and tribal groups in the area. But this is a photo of Chief Alquema, or his American name was Joseph Hutchins. He was one of two tribal leaders who negotiated a treaty with the superintendent for Indian Affairs at the time, Anson Dart. And they agreed on this piece of property. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but it's the area in the middle of the map that's sort of hatched. And you can see, if you look kind of up towards the top of the map, you'll see Chemekety. So that's where Salem is. And then if you go down to this sort of hatched part, this hatched sort of half circle, that is east of Jefferson. So that gives you kind of an idea of where that piece of property was, or that piece of land was, that the Santiam Kalapuya negotiated with Anson Dart for in 1851. However, when this treaty went back to the United States Congress, it was not ratified, and it was really, it's just one of those things that feels very, it's such a stark injustice. I think I mentioned that word before, but it just feels really, no, it's one of those things that's really frustrating to learn about when you go back to go through this history in more detail. So in 1855, there's a group of tribes who joined together to sign a Willamette Valley Treaty, which really does not have as good of terms as these originally negotiated treaties. And the one in this area was the one that created the reservation of the Grand Ronde, and that's where a lot of descendants of the Santiam Kalapuya went. But there are descendants in other areas as well, like the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs and the Confederated Tribes of the Silex. So I just want to take 1 second to kind of step away from the general narrative here and talk about why I think it's so important to study this kind of history. And I think that is because these injustices feel so stark that it's really important to sort of remember and appreciate Indigenous history in the area, and really try to learn more about how Indigenous people resisted these acts of colonizations and successfully survived colonization. You can still go to the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, you can go to the Chachulu Cultural Museum, and you can learn about the culture and traditions of the Kalapuya. So I'd really encourage you to do that in order to sort of try to start to better these injustices as people who love Oregon and who live here. But we'll go back to Salem. This is an early development of the town. You'll see here, this is a photo of William Wilson. So he is a lay member of the Mission Party. And I think what's really interesting about Wilson's story is that he sort of really benefits from these these land practices that the missionaries were really criticized for at the end of the missionary period. He sells off this big piece of what is essentially now downtown Salem in order to fund what is Willamette University and the Capitol construction. And you'll see here, he kind of lays out a specific area for the Capitol with Wilson Avenue, which this park is still here, but the Capitol actually faces towards the north now instead of towards the river. So you'll see that orientation has changed. He also was a former lay member. So yeah, just an example of how he did make a lot of money off of that land speculation. So I don't know, it's just kind of interesting, I think. So going back to the house, after the mission was dissolved in 1844, they sold off all of the holdings of the mission, including the house. J.B. McLean was the person who bought it, and he ran the mill for a while, but the house also functioned as a post office, a territorial treasury, boarding house, courtroom, apartment. It was a fancy Victorian for a while, so the house went through a lot of really drastic changes after it served as that mission house. And this is sort of an example of that. You can see here that in the red square is the original foundation of the house, the original sort of square thing that you see in those old etchings of the house. And all of these big pieces around the side are sort of Victorian fancy parts that have been put on, or apartment parts that have been put on as the house goes through time. Right down here is a photo of the brick foundation of the original part of the house as photographed when it was being moved in 1963. This will become very exciting later, so I encourage you to remember this particular photo. And this is just a couple more pictures of the house being moved in 1963. I think the house is pretty interesting in terms of the history of preservation in Salem too. It was sort of one of the founding parts of the Willamette Heritage Center, which is a really cool museum that I think is an incredible resource that we have here in Salem. And so sort of the impetus to save that house was part of that movement to create that park. But you'll see here that they actually removed the Victorian pieces, which is like the front piece on this bottom photo. They removed this and they left just the original part of the house, which is what was moved to the Willamette Heritage Center in 1963. So you can see it's on its little rollers. There's a history of moving a lot of buildings in Salem, and they always seem to get stuck under stuff. Like this one looks like it barely squeaked under those wires. There's like ones that get stuck under bridges all the time. It's kind of funny. I don't know why that keeps happening, but you'll see here that the Willamette Heritage Center restored the house to its original 1840 look. So that's what you see if you go visit the house there today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kimberly for the excavation.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. That's such an it's a very interesting history. Of course, I've heard it before, but every time I learn something new, I think. All right, so now I'm going to jump in and talk about the excavation. And so as you remember, because I was talking about process earlier, now that we have a deeper understanding of the history and significance of the site, the next question that we needed to answer was whether or not development itself will uncover or harm any significant resources or not. On your screen, on the left side of your screen, you can see that we took the trouble of having the developer overlay their proposed building foundation plans over the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So those are maps I think that we really rely on them a lot. If you've never looked at a Sanborn fire insurance map, they're really fun. They show, we have them for Salem, they have them for actually many states, and they show building foundations and often can tell you quite a lot about development over time. So anyway, so what we needed to figure out was, number one, we didn't know whether there was anything at all remaining from the JasonLee house, the foundation, any associated outbuildings. Further, we didn't know, you can see there are 3 additional houses with, based on the research that we did, they were just World War II era cottages with no deep significance associated with them, but we still needed to know, and the developer needed to know, whether they were going to encounter anything during development. So before the pandemic hit, we started conversations with Professor Pike and Willamette, and we also reached out to the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, who we wanted to further our partnership with, and we reached out to the private property owner. So something to point out, so this is a private development, as I mentioned, but they're receiving public money. Normally, the archaeological compliance, that clearance, is the responsibility of the private property owner. But in this case, because of the significance of the JasonLee house and the significance of the site, we offered assistance with the archaeological testing and the clearance, and we were hoping to do a public archaeology project. And he agreed, but that was again before the pandemic hit. So we had to pivot a bit. You can see here on the left side of the screen it was a 1926 Sanborn fire insurance map overlaid over the aerial again, so that we could try to begin to figure out where things were on the site. We continued on with our partnership with Willamette, and Professor Pike had a class that was very helpful in doing some ground penetrating radar, again, prior to the stay-at-home order. We also had some assistance with the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, who also came out with their GPR, and I'll show you some maps here in just a second. But we really had to adapt to these unexpected circumstances. We had planned to begin excavation in the beginning of April, and we were surprisingly, shockingly able to continue on schedule. And we were out on site for about a month. Our goals remained the same. We wanted to first start with this GPR non-invasive survey to try and figure out ahead of time what might still be intact. We also wanted to do some testing, some selective excavation, and some artifact recovery if there's anything on site, and then do some interpretation and photogrammetry at the end, which I'll wrap up when I at the end of this and talk a little bit about that. But how do we begin? So we began by submitting for our archaeological permit. So if you recall, when I was talking about all the state laws and what we have to do under state regulations, we had to apply for a permit, and we were so thankful that Ross Smith from Stantec Consulting, an archaeologist, offered his time, donated his time and efforts, and he applied for the permit and agreed to be our primary investigator on site. And in this permit, Ross, so as when you submit for an archaeological permit, you have to describe the significance of the site and identify as much as you can about what you know, and then define the methodology that you're going to use to learn more. So I'm going to walk you through now what we did in terms of additional research in addition to what Kirsten shared. So we looked at aerials such as this 1961 aerial, and with the help of our city surveyor, we tried to georeference that aerial to the site. You can see it's a little bit blurry, but you can see the roof of the JasonLee house, of course, with all its additions from this aerial. And then on the next slide, you can see these are the plans that Elizabeth Potter had uncovered during her work that Kirsten had talked about a little bit ago. And we also tried to geo-reference those plans to the site as well, to kind of help us figure out what we wanted to pull from the testing. So the ground penetrating radar, so if you click again, Kirsten, hopefully the image will show up, yay. So this is an image. So both of our partners, Willamette University and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, again, as I mentioned, used the ground penetrating radar to see if we could try to see if there's any clear evidence of the house, and in particular the house basement or any outbuildings on the site. And you can see here there were three different anomalies that showed up. The anomaly labeled as number 1, sort of that big blob there in the middle, is what we now know as the house basement. And so we were able to roughly align those with those points that we were able to georeference from the plans and the ones from the aerials. And then ultimately the reason for all of this was to help us map out our proposed test areas. So you can see here, this was the map that was submitted with our archaeological permit. They do nicely offer us some flexibility after we get into the field, and we did in the permit identify that we wanted to do up to 12 shovel tests or probes and up to 12 units, which we ended up doing. The map here just shows 5 units on that south end and then 8 shovel test probes. But when we got out into the field, we were like, we want to dig more. So, so we did. But all of that initial non-invasive survey really helped us to pinpoint precisely where we wanted to lay out those units and excavate, which is really important, especially when you have a very limited amount of time and volunteer efforts, and of course the pandemic to deal with. We wanted to make sure that we were digging in essentially the right area. I just want to point out that one of the questions that we had initially, and I don't know that we were able to discover anything even after our excavations, is on the Sanborn map, which I'm pointing to, but you can't see. There's an outbuilding that's square with a little circle. I don't know if you can point to it, Kirsten. We had that right there. We didn't know what that was. We had a lot of questions about what that might be. We still have a lot of questions about what that might be, and we never really were able to determine what that is. But hopefully, you know, at some point we can figure that out. That might be our second project along with the mill. We'll try and figure out what that ultimately was. So we had a lot of help. We had so many collaborative helpers and a lot of support throughout this project. So this picture here, you can see our City of Salem Public Works crews scraped the parking lot for us to remove the asphalt, so we didn't have to dig that by hand, and then we could begin laying out our units. And this next pair of photos shows you kind of a before and after. So on the left side, you can see that's before we laid everything out. And then we laid out 12 units in 2 blocks, and you can see they're covered here by that the boards, but the two blocks, and you can kind of see in this next slide, we were able to map out in block A, that was where we were hoping to find evidence of outbuildings. They didn't have trash service, of course, in the 1840s or even up through, of course, the early 1900s. So you can often learn a lot if you find a privy. We were hoping to find one, but we did not. But we did learn a lot about the soils, which I'll talk about in a minute. We did pull some artifacts from Block A, which of course, a majority of the artifacts associated with the pre-contact period were from this block, Block A, but also some fragments of ceramics. I'll show you some pictures of those as well. And a lot of bone actually, but not people bone, animal bone. So people were throwing things into their backyard, but just not in a beautiful, nice little compact area for us to discover. Block B, which is sort of at the center of this model that you can see, there's 2 layers to that. Well, 3 actually. So the units, they're 1 meter by 1 meter in size. And again, we had 6 in this block B, which it's really hard to see, but what this model shows is it's overlaying the house plans of that main 1841 portion of the house that's in the green. And then the red is the basement area. And so what you'll see some pictures here in a minute, but the thing to point out is that a majority of our units in Block B crossed the exterior brick foundation wall, which we were really excited about. So all of that non-invasive survey and GPR ahead of time really helped us to pinpoint where to dig, which was quite a relief because there's nothing worse than excavating and not finding anything. So we had, even with the pandemic and the reduced number of people, we had 30 volunteers contribute over 600 hours. On the left, I don't know if any of you can recognize her, that's Sydney. She's a Willamette student, now graduated, yes. She successfully defended her thesis. She helped out on site. And we also had a lot of significant help from volunteers from the Oregon Archaeological Society and other professional archaeologists. We did limit the total number of people on site to 15 at any time, and we maintained social distancing. And I'd never had to do archaeology wearing a mask. It's hard work anyway, but when you have to wear the mask, it's really hard. And the soils, especially when they got wet, as Professor Pike will attest to, there's a lot of clay once you get to about 30 centimeters below, and it was really difficult to screen. So Professor Pike took this drone shot of us. We had a lot of fun. I'm glad he was able to bring his drone. So you'll see I think at least one other picture that he took with the drone. So that was really helpful to have. So in addition to the challenge of the archaeology wearing masks, so you can go to the next slide, Kirsten, we had some challenging weather. You can see here, this is poor Eric. He, one of the volunteer archaeologists trying to excavate, well, he's trying to mop up the water so he can excavate. So when we had rain, and this is one of the findings I think that Professor Pike found, he had at least one student focus specifically on the analysis of the soils, which there's a very high clay content. And this unit pictured on the left side of your screen, that was in essentially what would have been the backyard of the house. And we think we have a theory that the basement was constructed so that the people could better deal with water. So it was more, instead of storage, that it was more for a place for the water to go. We can't confirm that, but that's a theory we have just watching the behavior of the water and the composition of the soils. And then you can see, oh, don't change it. I don't want to talk about the picture on the right. If you can go back. Yeah, so that's Allison, and she's actually in one of the units that's within the basement area. So the soils within the basement area, it was really mixed context. So fill, And what we think happened is that when they removed the structure in the 60s, well, they had, right away when they deconstructed the house, we think that they just shoveled all of the, all that, I don't know if you remember the picture of the house being broken apart, all that debris, the wood and all of that, they shoved it into the basement as much as they could, the wood and the brick. And so the stratigraphy is quite different in the units that were in Block A than in Block B. And then in Block B in particular, it's very different when you're inside the basement as opposed to outside. So now we can go to the next one. So we also did our best to adapt our public archaeology outreach as well. You can see me here trying to do some interpretation to someone sitting in a car. Many people stopped by in their cars while we were working. So I created a little site notebook with pictures. We created some YouTube videos. We were originally hoping to have a public archaeology open house similar to the one we had at the police facility a few years ago. But instead we did a Facebook Live event. If you're interested in more information, you can watch those YouTube videos. They're on our city website. We have a project page related to those. So just a little bit about the artifacts. So we recovered over 2,500 artifacts, which we're still curating, and I'm really excited. I'm hoping I'll get several Willamette student interns to help me finish curating them. This is a picture of a bottle fragment. That's one of my favorite artifacts that we recovered. It's hard to see in the picture, but this is the base of the bottle, and there's a little round circular feature, which is evidence that that bottle was actually blown. And this method of producing bottles, they stopped doing it prior to the Civil War, so we know this was a very old bottle fragment, and this was found within that mixed context there in the basement. And to the next slide, here's a few pictures of some of the fragments that we found. So you can see we've got 3 examples here of different ceramics, transfer prints, and some with maker's marks with the writing on it. So that'll help us do some research about precisely where they were made and where they came from. We shared some of these pictures with the lab at Fort Vancouver, and we can confirm that the ones you can see here are from that early period. We're not quite sure if they were used during that very small period of time, 1841 to 1844, or later when the Victorian era of the house or not. And here's a few buttons. Not pictured here is that we also found a glass marble. That was kind of fun. And here are some of what we think are the pre-contact era artifacts. We found a couple beads. You can see the 2 pictures on the right hand of the screen, and there's a gastrolith, which is on the upper left hand corner. If you know what that is, it's a rock that's been polished by a chicken who probably swallowed it, and they were very common and often used to create beads or other things. There's a bone. This is an animal bone. We think it was an elk. It was pretty large. And we found that in Block A. So the most exciting find was evidence that the original brick basement of the house, I think Kirsten had showed you a picture before, and the picture on the left shows you before the excavation was complete. And you can just see, as I mentioned before, that a lot of that debris we think was just pushed into the basement. And so mixed in with that brick, that's where we found ceramics and bottle pieces and that sort of thing. We also found fragments of burned wood. There was a fireplace, according to the plan, relatively near here, but one of the pieces of wood we found was a pretty big beam and it was burned. We don't know if they tried to burn some of this before they pushed it in. That would require additional investigation. But we were very, very excited to find this very nice intact brick wall. We still have a lot of questions. How did they get brick here in 1841? There was a house built entirely of brick in Yamhill County, the George Gay House, and they made brick right on site. One of the things that we were looking for was evidence that they made brick, but we didn't find anything. So this, the next slide shows you, again, one of Scott's great drone shots, which gives you a big picture overview of the two blocks. So block A is on the top of your screen, and block B, which is, it's smaller, but that's where we pulled most of the interesting stuff out of. So the basement wall, you can see, crosses all of our units here. And it was just it was very, very exciting to be able to find that wall. And we did clear a lot of the brick that I showed you in the previous picture out, and it's in my lab right now. We're hoping to work with the property owner and the developer to develop some sort of interpretation on the site with this brick. We're not sure what it will look like yet, but we hope we can do something with that. So just briefly to mention the northern part of the site where those World War II cottages are, we did 12 shovel test units on the north end of the property. And I know that Professor Pike and his students also did some GPR there. We wanted to better understand the soils and the stratigraphy, and also what to expect when the property was redeveloped. We were in particular looking for, again, a privy, any kind of evidence associated with the people that lived on the house. We were honestly looking for evidence that they made brick to build the foundation, but we didn't really find much. We didn't find anything, and no significant features were found as part of this testing. So the great news is, after basically a month of that field work during a pandemic, we were able to complete that historic clearance process, and we were able to confirm that while we did have a significant archaeological site, the site was located in what was going to continue to be the parking lot. The only concern was some utilities that were proposed to run through the parking lot, but because we knew precisely where things were, we were able to work with the developer to ensure that none of that resource would be adversely affected by the development. We're continuing to work with the developer, who currently has a building permit in review, I actually saw today, for relating to installation of fire lines. So I'll be taking a look at that. And Ross Smith, along with Sydney, has been monitoring the ground disturbing activity throughout the development. So all in all, a very successful project. I do just want to mention briefly, and to touch a bit, pick up on what Kirsten talked about during her discussion, that one of the goals over the next year, in addition to curating the artifacts, is to work on interpretation of this site, to tell the story of this place in a way that decolonizes this history and incorporates the Native American perspective of this contact period when JasonLee and the other missionaries arrived. We're going to be working with the Oregon Travel Information Council also to replace the Beaver Board, which, if you're familiar with that area, it was erected just south to this site on the bridge, and we want to update it to a more appropriate interpretation. These Beaver Boards, if you've traveled anywhere around Oregon, you're probably familiar with them. They were part of a statewide program in Oregon that began in the 1940s, I think. And while they're great, some, including this one, really need to be updated. And the state has been working on updating them. They're aware of that. So you can see that picture to the right side of your screen there is one of their updated ones. So lastly, I'm going to leave you where I started, again, with process. We didn't begin in Salem. I started here in 2005, actually, consulting, and came on full time in 2009, and we didn't have an archaeological program at all. And the JasonLee project is, I think, a great example that illustrates how you can incorporate archaeology into a local planning department, community development department. And you know, we began by doing projects collaborating with Willamette University, with the tribes, and then we worked with our HLC and our council to update our historic preservation plan and create our map by working with the tribes. We formalized a relationship. We've become more formal and adopted code now, and we've now just started having regular monthly meetings, just like we have our Landmarks Commission meetings. So we believe it's a good model that other jurisdictions can follow. And we actually shared this at the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions conference this summer, and an article will be coming out soon in their national magazine about this. So we're pretty excited about that. So that's all I have. Oh, I think you have to keep, sorry. Sorry, I made it like fun and now it's like, oh dear. Well, now we're done.
Those are the developers' children, I believe.
Yes, yep, that is. They're adorable. They came and helped screen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I see some clapping, well deserved. Yay.
Oh, and Scott, if there's time, I don't know if you want to. So photogrammetry, I don't know if there's time for you to show the fun stuff. If not, that's okay.
I'll do it real quick, but then when I go back, I have to manipulate screen sharing here. Let's see if I do it this way.
Well, while he's doing that, so for interpretation, yeah, that's one of the things we're wanting to do. And Scott came out and.
So can you see the model?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this is one of the trenches in Unit B, where we took a couple hundred photographs and then stitched them together. But so what we're seeing here is the wall. This is the wall to the basement. And to the right, this would be the east side.
Right, yeah. Outside of the wall. So yeah, that was Jackie's unit, yeah.
Right, the cleanest of all units.
Yes.
And so this is the outside of the wall. The basement would have been to the left. And you can see it's still jumbled. We have metal, I believe that's metal sticking out. It's burned, bricks tossed in. So we think this is part of the demolition of the house into the basement. And then the warping of the wall right here was probably a relic of that demolition as well. They may have had tractors or something.
Yeah, we think like a bulldozer or something. I don't know.
So,
yeah,
and then
really cool.
You can see that the stratigraphy also, with this darker material, it does dip down into the basement here. So.
Yeah, you think they brought fill in? They brought fill in to level it after they pushed everything into the basement.
Yeah, they must have here.
Yeah.
And then you can see the cap of gravel before they laid the pavement down.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I don't know, is there anything additional you want to share about the soils and the water on the site?
Yes, it's unstratified flood deposits, probably from Mill Creek and or the Willamette River that just inundated the area, and they built on top of it. It must have been somewhat elevated, but which is why the indigenous population may have built a village there to prevent it, from flooding as much. But it's just one big unit of muck of clay.
Yeah. Well, we really experienced that. And I mean, Kirsten talking about how much they were complaining about the flooding and the mosquitoes. I imagine when they moved there, they were just like, oh man.
Kept building in weird places, I guess.
Yeah.
So I said at the beginning that we would go to a chat room to do the questions, but I think we're a small enough group where if people have questions, you can just unmute your microphone and ask away. I'll go ahead and monitor the chat room as well, but feel free to ask a question.
If Eddie Willamette student is interested in helping to work on this project, where can we go to find information?
Yeah, so, well, you can contact me directly, and Professor Pike has my contact information if you need that. If you just want to like take a look at our project page, I feel like I'll just give you that too, Scott, but you can go to the cityofsalem.net and just type in JasonLee, and the first result should be the JasonLee project page, and we've got several YouTube videos and the tour of the site that we did back in May. But if you're interested in helping with the curation of the artifacts, if you can contact me, but if you want to earn credit, then you should go through Scott. I think Professor Pike can assist you.
So Ursula, was that you who asked the question? I didn't see the name pop up.
Yeah, it was me.
We'll talk.
Yes, I need help.
So did you learn something about the the pioneers and their life in Salem that that you didn't expect?
Oh, that's a really good, hi, good to see you.
Hi.
The brick was the most surprising to me, and I don't know if you've had a chance to watch the walkthrough tour. So I walked through with Kylie, and I asked her what was her most surprising thing, or what is your most burning question after learning what you've learned today at the walk around. And for both of us, the biggest question is, where did they get the brick? Where did they get the brick in 1841? And we don't know. And I don't know, Scott, if you have any theories, but we have to think that they made it on site. The brick itself is not uniform. It does not look like it came from a factory. So, but that said, just like the mill, where's the mill? We never found direct evidence of a location where they were making it. So that's, if there's one question I would really like to answer, that would probably be the question, because
Right, and Willamette has lore as well that the students
that early
at
period.
faculty got together and built and made the bricks for Waller Hall.
Yeah,
Right. That's
And
why there's the dip behind Waller Hall, basically.
so they say.
they made
yeah.
their own brick there,
Yes, basically they took the clay from there.
right?
But
And
it would have to be fired. I mean, it's oxidized. It was heated at some point, so
so
Mhm.
there should be some evidence somewhere.
something. Somewhere.
So
Mhm.
yeah, that would probably be the biggest surprise, I
Mhm.
guess.
The china that you found, is that imported or is that locally made in the United States?
Some of it is. So one of the fragments that we found, only a portion of the words, of course, because it's broken, are visible, but it appears to say made in China, and it's very, very old. So that's one of the fragments that we've pulled out, and we do want to definitively find out more about it.
So I had, doesn't some of this stuff come on the Lausanne?
Could,
stuff
yes.
with the mills and in the, I'm
Or
just
from Fort Vancouver, maybe. Yeah.
right.
Yep.
And I guess just one comment I have for Willamette students. There is if you want to read more about the background and a more sort of critical view of the context in which Lee was operating, the Oregon Historical Quarterly's winter 2019 issue has some great material about sort of the background, and that's available to all Willamette students through a special arrangement with the Oregon Historical Association. If you go to the convocation website, you can download the whole issue. And it has a lot of really interesting kind of information about sort of the stuff that Kirsten was talking about, and kind of Lee's role in sort of land seizure, really, in some ways. So it kind of frames the whole thing in an interesting way.
Thank you. Yeah, very cool.
I do want to mention one of the students who was working on the project last year, Kenna, the water, the tower, that outbuilding that you showed on.
Yeah,
that
we never figured out. Yeah.
We were really hoping the GPR would pick up a signal there showing something. And we had absolutely nothing, which in and of itself is data. So nothing is sometimes data as well. But in the research, the students really think that it's a water tower, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe a wind turbined water well. And if that's the case, then what may only remain is this very small hole into the ground that goes deep into the down into the water table. So it'd be hard to find using remote sensing.
We'd need to excavate.
Yeah.
Do you think it was in the alleyway?
I don't think it was that far out. Doesn't measure that far.
But it probably wasn't in one of the units that we excavated in
No, I
A.
think we missed that.
We missed it. Darn it.
It's basically where
Yeah.
the tents were set up.
Yeah, probably. Well, we do. We need to do another excavation and look for the mill, although I don't know where that could be. I mean,
I think it may have been across the stream.
yeah. Harder to do an excavation over there.
Yeah, there's some homes there. So
Yeah. Won't give up though. Yeah. Well, I see you've got another one. Do you want to talk about this one? This is the one where I had the pictures, the Eric's
oh, image
unit?
here. I was just
Yeah.
pulling it up because
Yeah, with the brick wall.
right? I just
Yeah.
want
Yeah, cool.
the bricks are in very, very nice condition, but it's interesting that the one on top is definitely of different quality. I don't know if it's a different source of clay or produced in a different way or just fired at a lower temperature.
I don't know. Yeah.
Don't
It'd be
know.
very interesting. And I
There's
do
also-
have a lot of brick in my lab, so anyone who wants to do some additional analysis.
It'd be interesting to know if they were a common size.
Yeah.
Or
I see that brick that's kind of sticking out on the right-hand side looks more like that lighter color brick, and there are several. So maybe that's another layer of the wall that was just done in that different color.
it's so much larger though. This might just be debris from the demolition.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it'll be harder to provenance.
I had a question about the previous image you had up, Professor Pike.
Okay, I'll try to get back there.
If you, yeah, thanks.
This one.
Yeah, that one. I'm just curious to know what the lower right corner is and what that section, also very clean, and then has a deeper spot. Yeah, that whole area.
Yeah, this is a relic from the excavation. We were looking at the soils and we just wanted to make sure there was no archaeology beneath the surface, the upper surface. We just wanted to make sure there was no archaeology below.
It's so clean. It looks so nice.
Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this. We excavated 10 centimeter levels until we got to a sterile level. So, and this is, so you can see the brick wall, and this was on the east side. So as we found also in a lot of the units in block A, we reached sterile pretty quickly. So, but not in the inside not on the west side, like you can see here inside the basement. We never reached, we just stopped. Yeah. There was a lot in there. We could have kept going.
Is this house, it seems to me like it's from that time when the kitchen was a separate building? Or was that done in Oregon?
We didn't find any evidence of outbuildings, but yeah, I'm familiar with one of the very first houses I worked on. This was when I was in graduate school back east. It was a 1760s era house, and we did a Habs hair report on it, and it was beautiful watching the evolution of the kitchen. So it did start out as a separate building, then it was attached and outside of the house, and then it moved inside. But we didn't find any evidence, unfortunately. We were looking for outbuildings actually, and the site was scraped pretty clean, and per the analysis that Scott and his team did on the soils, you know, I don't know, we have a theory, and Scott, maybe you can weigh in terms of the continual sort of flooding and receding. We didn't find a lot of artifacts in the backyard, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this. If you've been to the Willamette Heritage Center and you see how JasonLee House is now, and it's got the kind of beautiful porches on the front of the house originally faced east. So the original outbuildings could have been where the road is now. So we wouldn't have been able to find that evidence. And they, through the evolution of the house and the multiple additions, and then it was reoriented so that it faced Broadway. So over time it changed. And so through that change, we may have lost some of the original evidence. And then all we have are the Sanborn maps, which we didn't start getting those for the earliest, well, we showed some pictures of them, but they don't show the earliest period, that period that we're most interested in, the 1841 through 1844. So I don't know that we'll know.
Yeah, and we did a walkthrough of the house that's at the Willamette Heritage Center with Kylie Pine, who has studied the history of it. And as I recall from our tour, she was saying that when the house was built, it was never intended as a single residence, but it was built as 4 separate units. So
4 families.
So JasonLee only had a quarter of the whole house. It's just named after him, and because he was directing the mission at that time. And in the house, there are 2 central fireplaces that, with chutes that go up, and each of the rooms or each of the units would have had a fireplace stove connected to that chimney. So it looks like they were cooking in the house. They were not luxurious conditions at all, by any means, but they would have had a privy outside, and it would be wonderful to find that.
Yeah, we were hoping to find that. Scott, do you have an image of the middle unit?
I have one more, yes. In theory. Yeah, this is the, wait, wrong one. Not that one, this one.
Yes.
Yeah, this one's a little overexposed. It was a sunny day. So here's the wall. These blocks, you've seen them in the other photos as well. These were bases for the support beams that would have gone up to the house.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are foundations made of brick.
Yeah.
Basements to the right here, and this is to the east.
And that square there in the upper corner, that's another sampling that you did, just like in
another sampling. And again, we were also just wanting to make sure we were below in the archaeology level.
And just something to mention. So these, you're seeing 3 separate units here, kind of in a row, and the one furthest to the right on your screen there, that's the inside of the basement. And we did find a lot of burned material in there. I think that I mentioned that earlier. And the fireplace, if memory serves, that Scott was referencing, we think was abutting this area. But if we would have excavated another unit to the south, we may have uncovered it. So
yeah, it would have been interesting, because it could have been too, when they moved the house, they would have left the brick foundations for the fireplace, and that the soot and black could just be from that.
Yeah. You can see the water even.
Because it rains a little bit in Oregon.
A little bit.
Okay. Any other questions? I think. Well, excellent. Well, Kirsten and Kimberly, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys.
So,
Appreciate it.
okay.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone has a good evening. It's supposed to storm tonight, so just be prepared for whatever that means. Okay. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Do you want us to stay? Okay.
No, you should go home, have your dinner, or have your after talk wine, or whatever you.
Pizza. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Scott,
thank
do
you.
you need anything from me to share more information? Do you need a link to the project page, or do you think you can?
I can find that and I'll post it. I'll contact Ursula. She's in my archaeology class. She's a great student. So
Okay, great.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
We'll stop